There's a wound most men carry but never speak of. It doesn't bleed, it echoes. It's the quiet fear that you're not enough, and worse, that someone might eventually see it. You mask it with charm, effort, performance. But late at night, when no one's watching, the question returns, am I being respected or just tolerated? And the hardest part is, you're not sure anymore. Because when you start adapting to be liked, you stop being able to tell when you're valued. You didn't feel it all at once. It came like fog, gradual, familiar. The way she stopped leaning in, the way your words started needing explanations. You told yourself it was timing, stress, just a phase. But underneath you felt the shift, the invisible one, the slow erosion of presence. Not hers, yours. Something inside you bent, just a little. And that's where it begins, not with betrayal, but with self-abandonment disguised as patience. The Stoics warned us, don't become a stranger to your own soul. But that's what happens when your value becomes dependent on someone else's gaze. You start walking on eggshells while calling it love. You offer more, hoping to feel more. And what once felt like strength turns into subtle anxiety dressed in niceness. You're not leading, you're negotiating. And women feel that, not with logic but with instinct. The energy shifts, the frame dissolves, and she pulls away, even if she doesn't know why. So ask yourself, did she change? Or did you? Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to slip out of alignment. The Stoic vision doesn't chase love, it attracts it through integrity, through stillness, through the refusal to betray one's center just to be chosen. And this video isn't about judgment, it's about vision. Because until you see these low-value patterns clearly, you'll keep calling them care. And one day you'll wake up wondering, when did I stop being respected? You noticed it, not in what she said, but in what she didn't correct. The way she no longer looked back when leaving. The delayed responses that used to come instantly. The warmth was still there, technically, but it no longer reached the skin. It felt like walking into a room you once called home, only to realize the furniture hadn't moved, but the feeling had. And the cruelest part, you convinced yourself it was fine, normal, temporary. But deep down you knew there was a dissonance, a quiet, unspoken misalignment, like two instruments playing almost the same melody but not quite. And so you tuned yourself to her rhythm, adjusted, softened, smiled more, spoke less, hoping the harmony would return. But in that recalibration, something subtle fractured. You weren't connecting anymore, you were managing, holding things together with tension instead of presence. And tension never sustains love, it drains it. She didn't pull away with force. She pulled away with silence, with absence wrapped in routine. And you, thinking it was just a rough patch, doubled down, gave more, explained more, reached harder. But what you didn't see was this: the more you filled the space, the more she disappeared into it. Because attraction isn't built in the noise. It's built in gravity. And gravity isn't effort, it's alignment. Something you'd slowly lost while trying to be enough. The truth is, something was always off. Not wrong, not toxic, just off. Like reading a sentence where one word doesn't belong, and you felt it even when you didn't name it. That's the thing about misalignment. It's not always loud. Sometimes it shows up in eye contact that doesn't hold, in affection that feels rehearsed, in conversations that sound right but feel empty. The Stoics teach us to see clearly. And sometimes clarity begins with admitting, this isn't love anymore, it's maintenance. It never looks dangerous at first. In fact, it looks kind, thoughtful. You start checking in more often, asking if she's okay, anticipating her needs before she speaks. You think you're being a good man, present, invested, attentive. But slowly, without warning, your center begins to lean. You go from grounded to guessing, from steady to seeking. And what you call care is actually a quiet negotiation for closeness, a trade of truth for tolerance. That's the disguised pattern, the slow, invisible descent into over-functioning. You begin carrying both your emotions and hers. You step into silence and try to fix it. You soften your truth to avoid rocking the boat. But the more you adjust, the more you fade. She doesn't see strength anymore, she senses a shift. Your energy goes from masculine pull to emotional sponge, and no matter how gently you hold her, she can feel when you've dropped yourself. It's like walking into a room where the air feels heavy, but no one says why. You're still there, but not fully, because you're no longer leading with clarity. You're reacting to absence, hoping that if you just love harder, she'll come back. But the Stoics warned, he who seeks too much approval ends up losing himself. This isn't love, it's submission disguised as devotion, and what once felt natural now feels like effort wearing a smile. So pause. Ask yourself the question you've avoided: am I connecting or compensating? Because patterns like this don't explode, they erode, quietly, completely, and unless you name them, you'll repeat them, with a new face, a new story, the same ending. This is not about blaming her. It's about seeing you. Seeing where you handed over your gravity for comfort, and realizing that comfort cost you everything that once made you magnetic. Silence, when misunderstood, becomes the most misused tool. Weak men use it to punish, to retreat, to sulk in their unmet needs. But powerful silence, Stoic silence, is presence without performance. It holds the room. It holds her, not by force, but by gravity. It doesn't beg to be heard. It lets her wonder, not out of manipulation, but because a man at ease in silence makes a woman curious. And curiosity is the seed of lasting desire. Psychologically, silence creates a gap. The brain hates unresolved space. It seeks meaning, pattern, closure. That's the zygonic effect. When you don't rush to fill that space with words, you allow emotional imprint to take root. She replays your expression, your pause, the steadiness behind your restraint. A man who doesn't explain himself constantly, who doesn't react to every emotional ripple, becomes unpredictable in the most grounded way. But here's the trap. Many men mimic silence but carry chaos. They say nothing but vibrate with insecurity. And she feels that too, because real silence isn't empty, it's full of self-command, of unspoken boundaries, of presence that doesn't seek reassurance. When you speak only when it's time to speak, when your stillness is not defense but depth, she can feel it in her gut, in her nervous system, and that builds tension, not confusion. The Stoics mastered silence not because they lacked words, but because they understood the value of restraint. Epictetus said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can offer isn't a perfectly timed reply, but the space between words, the space where truth echoes, and in that space, attraction becomes less about effort and more about energy. Maybe what you loved wasn't her. Maybe it was the reflection of who you became in her presence. The way her eyes made you feel seen. The way her laughter gave your words meaning. But was it truly intimacy or just projection? Were you connecting with her or with the version of yourself she seemed to validate? The Stoics warned us, beware the illusions we build from our own longing, because the most seductive mirrors are the ones we don't realize we're looking into. You saw her as the answer, but what you really saw was your unspoken need, wrapped in charm, voice, and timing, and so you filled in her silences with hope. Assigned depth where there was only curiosity. You mistook attention for intention, affection for alignment, but intimacy requires 2 whole people, not one offering themselves up for reflection and the other simply absorbing the light. That's not love, that's theater. And you were playing a role you didn't know you'd been cast in. She may not have lied. In fact, she may not have promised anything at all. But you did, to yourself. You promised that this time, if you gave enough, stayed gentle enough, remained steady enough, you'd be chosen. But choosing isn't love. It's a transaction unless it's rooted in truth. And the truth is, you weren't loving her. You were loving how she made you feel about you. Epictetus said, if you want to be loved, love yourself first. But no one taught you how to tell the difference. Now you see it. The difference between connection and craving, between being seen and being reflected. And that's the shift, not loud, not sudden, but deep. You no longer need her to mirror your worth, because your worth is not a reflection, it's a root. And like any strong root, it doesn't need sunlight every day to survive. It needs stillness. ground, and the willingness to stop chasing the illusion long enough to find the truth. In her and in you, it didn't happen all at once. No collapse, no confrontation. Just a quiet moment, one you barely noticed, when you stopped being the gravity and started becoming the echo. You adjusted a little more than you should have, laughed when you didn't feel it, held back your truth so the moment wouldn't shift. And in doing so, you gave away something sacred. Not your love, your stance, that invisible posture that once made you magnetic, now subtly folded into permission-seeking. You told yourself it was compromise, emotional maturity, but beneath that logic was fear, the fear of losing her, of becoming forgettable. So you over-explained, you anticipated, you offered softness not from depth, but from desperation, and what once felt like connection turned into an unspoken audition. You weren't being with her. You were trying to be chosen. And in that pursuit, you crossed the line from presence into proving, without even realizing it. She didn't need to pull away. You did it for her. With every small betrayal of your own standard, with every moment you waited for her reaction before deciding how you felt. And this is the paradox. The more you needed to be accepted, the less attractive you became. Because women don't chase certainty, they respond to centeredness. And when your value started depending on her mood, her message, her rhythm, you lost the very thing she once leaned into, your self-governance. So now ask yourself, not with shame, but with sobriety, was I loving her, or trying to earn the right to stay? Because true love doesn't beg, it doesn't shrink, it doesn't mold itself to fit another's uncertainty. The Stoics knew this. Freedom is the only worthy goal, and freedom begins when your worth is no longer tied to being wanted. The moment you gave yourself away wasn't loud, it was quiet. But now it's time to take it back. Look closely, not at her silence, not at her shift, but at your own reaction to it. That tightness in your chest, the overanalysis, the compulsion to explain, fix, perform. This isn't about her anymore. It's about the mirror. The Stoic mirror doesn't reflect others, it reflects you. It asks, are you moving from truth or from tension? Are you grounded or are you guessing? The answers are rarely loud, but they are always honest. You blamed her distance, her confusion, her inconsistency. But the real drift began when you stopped responding from your center and started reacting from your fear. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." And yet, how often have you handed that power away? Let her mood define your self-worth. Let her presence, or lack of it, decide your peace. This isn't her fault. This is your forgotten responsibility. When you trade your posture for her proximity, you lose more than just attraction, you lose authorship. The man who once led with gravity now follows her signals like a shadow, but shadows don't attract, they mimic. And in that mimicking you vanish. Stoicism invites you back, not to become indifferent, but to become whole, to choose how you feel, how you show up, how you hold yourself, regardless of who stays or who shifts. So ask yourself now, gently but firmly, are you steering your emotional state? Or are you waiting for her to do it for you? Because until you reclaim that wheel, you will always live at the mercy of her wind. Epictetus taught, no man is free who is not master of himself. This is your turning point. The mirror doesn't lie. It only waits for you to stop searching outside and finally come home to the one place no one can take from you, your inner stillness. There are questions you never said aloud, but they shaped every glance, every text, every hesitation. If I stopped trying, would she still care? Did she ever want me? Or just the version of me that kept giving? You never asked, because asking meant facing the possibility that the answer might be silence. And so, instead of confronting it, you filled the space with effort. More kindness, more compromise, more of you, hoping you wouldn't have to hear what the silence was saying. But silence isn't cruel, it's clarifying. What's cruel is what happens when you avoid it, when you bury those questions deep enough that they start to shape your actions without your consent. You laugh too quickly. You agree too easily. You linger in situations long after your self-respect has left the room. And all the while, a quiet voice in you whispers, she didn't ask you to stay. Why are you still performing like she did? We fear uncertainty, so we replace it with stories. And the most dangerous stories are the ones built on unspoken questions. What if I'm not enough? What if I'm only valuable when needed? You don't need her to answer those. You need you to. Because the ambiguity isn't what drains you, it's your refusal to meet it with honesty. Stoicism doesn't teach us to escape emotion. It teaches us to name it, and what you won't name will quietly run your life. So what if you stopped hiding from the question? Just one. The one that's been with you since the moment she pulled back. Am I holding on because I love her, or because I'm afraid of who I am without her reflection? That question is a key, a blade, a mirror, and your answer, whatever it is, doesn't need to be pretty. It just needs to be true. Because healing doesn't start when you're certain. It starts the moment you stop pretending you're not lost. She withdraws, then returns. She gives you warmth one day, cool indifference the next. And you, feeling the shift, start decoding every signal as if love were a puzzle to solve. But what if it's not a game at all? What if her unpredictability is a pattern woven into the fabric of her emotional survival? Women, whether they know it or not, test not to manipulate, but to feel safe, to sense your edge, to feel where you end and where you begin holding your ground. She's not asking you to fix her uncertainty. She's watching what your uncertainty does to you. Do you crumble, overcompensate, get quiet, then resentful? Or do you remain rooted, aware, but unshaken? The Stoics would call this the test of your inner citadel. When her emotions storm, do you collapse into them, or become the quiet architecture that doesn't move? Because safety to her isn't in what you say, it's in how you don't flinch. Push-pull, boundary tests, strategic silence, these are not games in the childish sense. They are instincts, emotional sonar. A woman doesn't want to lead you, but she needs to know she can trust you to lead yourself. That your presence isn't reactive, but conscious. That your affection isn't desperate, but deliberate. If you're easily pulled off center, she will never feel safe surrendering hers, because stability isn't sexied until it's tested and survives. So next time she pulls away, don't rush in, don't collapse, observe, remain, not from arrogance, but from truth. You're not here to pass her tests. You're here to reveal who you are through them. The Stoic man doesn't avoid emotion. He absorbs it, filters it, and responds only when his values, not his wounds, are speaking. Because attraction isn't kept through performance, but through presence under pressure. And presence, when it's real, never chases the storm, it becomes the sky around it. Reclaiming the frame doesn't start with her. It starts with remembering where you left yourself. In the over-explanation, the second-guessing, the micro-adjustments you made to keep her comfortable while slowly erasing your own edges. A man loses his frame not in grand betrayals, but in quiet hesitations. And the first act of reclaiming it is silence. Not absence, but alignment. A stillness that says, I remember who I am even when you forget. The man who reacts is owned by emotion. He's pulled by moods, shifts, approval. But the man who responds from values, who knows what he will and will not tolerate, builds the kind of gravity women feel before they understand. He's not trying to lead. He is the lead. Not through dominance, but through clarity. Through knowing that you don't need to raise your voice when your presence already speaks louder than words ever could. Frame is not control. It's direction. It's the invisible container that allows chaos to exist without consuming you. When you hold it, you don't flinch at her tests. You don't chase her mood. You allow her waves, but you remain shoreline. Stoicism doesn't teach us to avoid emotion, it teaches us to master the reaction. You can't control her reactions. You can only control your presence. And presence is power, not in force, but in refusal to abandon yourself for validation. So let go of the fantasy of being loved perfectly. Replace it with the standard of being respected deeply. Stop negotiating your worth through how well you soothe discomfort. You're not here to be liked, you're here to be real. The man who reclaims his frame isn't rigid, he's rooted. And that rooting sends a signal clearer than affection. I don't need to be chosen to know I belong. I don't need to be understood to stand unshaken. Because respect isn't asked for, it's felt. And now it's quiet. Not because she texted back, not because the tension resolved, but because you did. You no longer need her clarity to find your own. You no longer scan her mood to check your worth. The storm hasn't disappeared, but the man inside it has stopped thrashing. What once felt like rejection now feels like release. What once felt like loss now feels like truth without distortion. And truth, when seen fully, doesn't sting. It steadies. You remember the beginning, that invisible shift, that ache you couldn't name. You thought it was her drifting, her silence. But it was always the space between who you were and who you were pretending to be to stay close. You see it now. Clear, without anger, without blame, just as light sees shadow, not to judge it, but to reveal its shape. Like the Stoic oak, you bend in the wind, but you do not break, because your roots no longer depend on her sun. She doesn't need to understand this version of you. You don't need to be read, solved, explained. You've stepped out of the mirror. The reflection is gone, but you remain real, whole, present. That's what this clarity gives, not control, not closure, but stillness. The kind that doesn't perform. The kind that simply is. You carry it now like breath, not to prove anything, just to live aligned with what you know, with what you feel, with what you no longer need to chase. The man who began this journey needed answers. He wanted to know what changed, what went wrong, what she felt. But the man standing here doesn't need her words to find peace. He doesn't fill silence with stories. He listens to the quiet, to the shift, to the part of him that once whispered, "You're losing yourself," and now calmly replies, "No, I was just waking up." It started with a whisper, a discomfort you couldn't name. You thought it was her drifting away, but now you see it was you slowly stepping out of alignment with yourself. You softened, you bent, not out of strength but out of fear. Fear of losing what you never truly had. And in that bending, you disappeared, piece by piece. Not all at once, but invisibly. Until even you couldn't feel your own weight anymore. You called it love, but it wasn't. It was performance delivered gently, wrapped in hope, shaped by unspoken need. And yet there was no villain, only reflection. She was never meant to carry the burden of your worth. You see that now. The silence wasn't the enemy, it was the invitation to pause, to feel, to return. You didn't need to be someone different to be kept. You needed to stop abandoning who you already were. The shift you felt wasn't in her tone or her timing. It was in your posture, your internal stance folding inward, hoping to be seen. But now that shift has reversed, not back to who you were before her, but forward into someone fuller, someone quieter, less reactive, more real. You're no longer performing for closeness. You're practicing presence. And that presence speaks more than explanation ever could. So here you are, at the end that was always a beginning, not needing to be chosen to feel whole, not waiting for permission to stand tall. You don't need to change to be loved. You need to remember who you are, so you don't trade that truth for temporary comfort. Because respect, real, lasting respect, doesn't come from being agreeable. It comes from being anchored, and that is the man she never forgets. If you've come this far, something in you already knows this isn't just a video. It's a mirror, one you can either turn away from or step fully into, because now you see the pattern, the bending, the soft negotiations of your worth. And the question is no longer why did it happen? The real question is, will you let it happen again? Awareness is not the finish line, it's the threshold, and what you choose from here becomes the shape of your next story. So pause, not to reflect, but to decide. You can scroll on, absorb this like a temporary insight, then return to the same cycles wrapped in new faces, or you can act, not loudly, not dramatically, but inwardly, deliberately. Revisit the words that stung. Journal the part of you that's been performing. Explore the silence you've avoided. If you're ready for more, deeper frameworks, private reflections, I've built a space for that. One made not for views, but for growth. Because you don't escape the pattern by waiting. You only escape it by confronting the part of you that needed to be liked more than it needed to be respected. And that shift, the internal, quiet shift is where the man you've been avoiding starts to come home. And maybe, just maybe, the love you're truly looking for begins there, in the man who no longer performs but embodies, no longer seeks permission, just truth. So here's your challenge: gentle but final act, or repeat. You've already seen how the story ends when you don't. You've already felt the slow erosion of self. What happens next is yours to author. Read deeper. Sit longer. Stay still when everything in you wants to reach, because a man who can master his presence without needing a reaction is a man no storm can shake. And that is who you were meant to become. Don't rush to the next thing. Let this moment breathe. Let the silence between us do what it's meant to do, echo inward. Because insight without integration becomes noise. And if you've truly felt this video, then what you do after it ends matters more than what you just watched. So here's your Stoic challenge for the next 7 days. Don't explain yourself, not once. Let your presence speak. Let your values act. See what happens when you stop trying to be understood and start simply being. There's a discomfort that comes from not filling the space. That urge to soften tension, to rush clarity, to reach for something, anything that reassures you. Resist it. Choose stillness. Just for a while. Let her unanswered message stay unanswered. Let her pullback remain unchased. Not to punish, but to prove to yourself that you're no longer moved by the temporary. You're practicing something more dangerous, more rare. Mastery over self. You don't need to be loud about this shift. Real changes hum, they don't shout. The Stoics knew that discipline wasn't about aggression. It was about restraint, not just in action, but in attention. So protect yours. Where you place your energy is a declaration of who you are. Make it deliberate, make it sacred. Your emotions are not enemies, but they are wild. And your job is to become the man who can sit with them without being run by them. So take this with you, not as advice, but as a vow. One question, whispered not once, but daily: what would this moment look like if I didn't need anything from it? Ask it when you're tempted to chase. Ask it when your ego demands reaction. Ask it when silence feels unbearable. Because the man who can sit with what is, without trying to reshape it, is the one who no longer lives in reaction, but in quiet, anchored freedom. Do you remember the beginning? That almost imperceptible shift, the moment where something felt off, but you said nothing. You blamed timing. You blamed her distance. But now, looking back through the lens of silence, self-respect, and stillness, you see it clearly. It wasn't her absence that broke you. It was the way you slowly disappeared from your own posture. And that realization, it doesn't burn. It anchors. You're no longer the man hoping to be chosen in a crowded room. You're the man who has already chosen himself, quietly, fully, without needing applause. That earlier version of you, the one that whispered, maybe if I show more of me, she'll stay, he's no longer leading. He has been replaced by someone calmer, someone deeper, someone who doesn't just know his worth, but refuses to place it in someone else's hands ever again. But what happens when she senses that shift, when your energy changes, when you no longer chase, no longer react, no longer fill every gap with words? What happens when she comes back, not for attention, but for gravity, for silence, for something she didn't know she was testing for in the first place? If you're curious, if you're ready for that story, then the next chapter is waiting, not for views, but for the version of you who's ready to stay unmoved. Until then, carry this. The invisible shift didn't break you, it revealed you. And everything that followed, every silence, every reflection, every test, wasn't punishment. It was purification. Now, when the wind rises, you don't brace, you breathe. And the same man who once whispered, "What did I do wrong?" now walks away asking, "What am I no longer willing to abandon?" That's the difference. That's the story. And it's only just beginning.